Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Olmo with Key Performance Ideas, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar, Got Your Budgeting Wrong? Why Your Budgeting Practice is Killing Your Bottom Line. Today's webinar will be presented by Scott Costello. Scott Costello is the Director of EPM Cloud for Key Performance Ideas and is a CPA and Certified Oracle Hyperion Planning, SBASE, and Hyperion Financial Management Consultant. He has more than 18 years of consulting management experience and has guided customers across a variety of industries in their implementation of successful planning, forecasting, close, and reporting solutions. Scott, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everybody, for your time today. As Greg said, I'm Scott Costello, and I'm going to be presenting a little bit about budgeting processes. So our agenda at a high level is really to discuss some of the challenges that we see with organizations dealing with budgets. As mentioned, I've been in the space for quite some time now, really focused on forecasting and budgeting process improvements. So we want to talk a little bit about those challenges and then leading practices and methodologies that we've been seeing in this space and considerations for when to use which ones. And then I'll leave you with some final thoughts. You know, we talk about forecasting. It's a challenge, and we look at just the market out there. This is just a couple excerpts from the past couple of years, but every quarter you'll see these kind of headlines. People or organizations missing their forecasts and the effect that does, whether the stock drops, which is usually a big impact, whether they're divested because of that, adjusted earnings can have an impact, consumer confidence can have an impact. So when organizations put these forecasts out there and they miss, it's a big deal, and it has a big impact from the very top to the bottom. One of the quotes I always like comes from Niels Bohr, who says, "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." Right? Which is a little tongue-in-cheek, obviously, but it's true. Right? Prediction is difficult. Whether we're predicting the global economy, whether predicting commodity prices, stock prices, your own personal finances, or finances for your organization. Anything about the future is unknown by definition. So trying to predict that is hard. So when we talk about forecasts, how are we seeing organizations try to make this a little bit better, given all these challenges? I mean, when we think about the challenges, even organizations who start to implement systems still invariably use some Excel or spreadsheet tools to help. And those systems are great for collecting tools and generating information, but they're not great for always doing the versioning and the analytics and applying a methodology. Even times when they do have a methodology applied, like something around drivers, those drivers can become stale or often challenged by the businesses who are getting the brunt of the costs associated with those drivers. A lot of times we'll see groups, too, that think there's one method for the whole business, and that's just not true. And a real big problem is the frequency. We live in a society and an economy today that's ever-changing. Every day there could be a up or down tick. You have to be able to be a little more proactive than reactive when it comes to forecasting. So I'm going to really talk about 4 different methods, explain when it's best to use those methods, give you a case study of an organization that's using one of those methods, and walk you through the details of it. So we're really going to talk about 4 unique methods today: predictive planning, driver-based planning, zero-based planning, and rolling forecast. Now, you might be looking at these and say, yeah, you know, I'm familiar with some of these. Driver-based planning is a pretty popular thing. Rolling forecast you hear a lot of. But I want to give you a little more detail on what we see groups using and how they're using it. So let's start with predictive planning. What do we mean when we talk about predictive planning? This is a method that trends data over time. A lot of times people refer to this as kind of run rate. So it's using the historical trends and applying that methodology to see how organizations will perform in the future. Maybe it's seasonal business, maybe it's non-seasonal, maybe it's autoregressive, but using a very more statistical approach to forecasting what the future looks like. When we talk about predictive planning, the best times to use these are for organizations with some good history of data. If you're a startup organization, if you just acquired a whole bunch of groups and you're trying to establish those, you might not always have that great data in order to do more of this predictive type planning. We also see that it's a little more critical on things like revenue and costs when the data is seasonal. So maybe retail organizations, shipping organizations, agricultural organizations. This is areas where we do see a pattern in the data that can go up 10%, it can go down 10%, but over the months, we'll see some sort of trend, and we can use different statistical models to help with that prediction. What's nice about predictive planning is when you spot trends for one business, for a type of service, a unit, a product, you can now take that, and when you launch new businesses, you launch new products, you apply those same trends if you have similar expectations. So you're not starting from scratch from any new product launch, new service, new store, or any new business unit. When we look at the P&L expenses, are often another good place for this, especially for things like cost center department expenses, where they might have a little more flat line, not as big of a bell curve for their plan, for their forecast. And they can use these prediction methodologies to make that even simpler. So a great example was an organization I worked with in the past, a logistics company. They would ship all this different, different products, different items to households as well as to businesses. So they wanted something that could help with daily volumes of shipment, because the daily volumes of shipment will help relate to how to drive the revenue, how to drive the costs, how to drive the people and the resources. So they really needed to find patterns in the business in terms of when people were asking for more shipments of different consumer goods, those sorts of things. And they needed to account for changes in holidays and weekends and shifts. Amazon was a good client of theirs as an example, and if we think about all the boxes that show up on our doorstep when we do those orders, it comes from different logistics organizations. And this one needed to monitor when are people changing their buying habits, when do we need to change things as well. So they found things by doing some predictive planning at 2 weeks before the lunar holiday of Easter was a high volume shipment time. Between Thanksgiving and New Year's was a high volume shipment time. And they saw the trends of when they were higher, the weekends, things like that. So they were able to use a few years of historical data and trend where they expected shipments to be going forward, and then drive that, those statistics to determine their revenue, their costs, and other expenses. So if you think about this, I wanted to give you a visual for each concept as well. With predictive planning, it's looking at that data over time. It doesn't have to be a 12-month period. It could be 18 months. It could be 2 years. It could be 5 years. Retail organizations look at this over, a 5 or 10-year period for new stores. Really, when does that particular business unit come to life? This is a very simple example of travel expenses. Throughout the year, travel expenses trend higher in the summer compared to the end of the year when people aren't traveling. So with this methodology, it's noting a trend year over year and applying that trend with a best case, worst case for the go-forward year. The nice thing about this methodology is I'm not rewriting anything. I might say, 10% well, 10% low, but I have a couple options for doing my predictions and a couple different scenarios of those predictions as well. But some things to consider with predictive planning. If you don't have all the data there, again, if you're a newer organization or you just don't have the appropriate data, this method really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If your organization is more commodity-based or commodity-dependent or dependent on other external factors where you don't have a lot of control, like exchange rates and those sorts of things or interest rates, this solution, this methodology is not going to be the best for you because no one really knows exactly what those are going to do. what is important is to continue to evaluate and determine those trends. It's great to look at things over a couple of years, but you should really keep monitoring that every year, 3, 4, 5, 10 years out. Do the same trends exist, or do you need to make adjustments? Like I said, it's great when you're starting new businesses, new products, new services, new locations, to take the history that you've already achieved at a similar one and try to apply that to the go-forward one instead of starting from scratch. This methodology makes it a lot simpler on the end users, people's involvement, because you're using statistics, you're using logic to drive that and adjusting things up and down. So that's one methodology, predictive planning. The next one I wanted to talk about is one most people are pretty familiar with. It's driver-based planning. Driver-based planning focuses on key metrics of the business and define how other items are going to perform. So rather than updating everything from scratch, you're actually just tweaking some key metrics. Maybe it's headcount, maybe it's revenue, maybe it's cost, and using those to drive the rest of your P&L, the rest of your balance sheet, and therefore cash flow. So it's great when organizations are looking at revenue or looking at cost data, and it is more commodity-based, it's more people-based or asset-driven. This methodology makes things a lot simpler. Manufacturing and services organizations, that are really driven by costs or driven by people, those metrics are measurable, and it's easy to use those metrics to then drive what the rest of the business is going to do. It's also great if you don't have a large team to revisit the budget. Right? So if you're looking at updating every month your budget or updating your forecast every month, it takes a lot of involvement. When you do a budget, it takes a lot of people. The idea behind driver-based planning is not necessarily to engage every person or have them look at every single line item in the P&L, but just have them flex the key metrics that drive the rest of the business, and therefore making it a little bit more proactive, again, rather than being reactive with your forecast. On the expense side, there are obviously some expenses that are directly driven by people, right? Most of them are. Salary, taxes, benefits. When we look at SG&A, that S line item, salary, is usually one of the biggest. And the G&A are usually derivatives of those. So a lot of times we see groups using it on the expense side too. So a good example of driver-based planning was a hotel management organization that we worked with. And they kept adding new hotels to their portfolio. But it was hard to kind of keep up capacity, as people came online and try to continue doing things in spreadsheets. So what they did was to develop a real driver-based method and use that as a consistent behavior for any new hotel that they brought on board. Now, for those of you, most of us are familiar with the hotel industry, right? You have all sorts of different groups, and you have different departments. So you have the kitchen, you have the spa potentially, you have housekeeping, you have the front desk. So there's a lot of different departments to a hotel, but they're driven very similarly. They're driven based on the occupancy of the hotel. Is there a big event coming up? Okay, let's plan for our occupancy of this hotel to go up 10%. Look at competitive rates. Look at the head count of the staff. Use these key drivers and really flesh out, the P&L almost down all the way to gross margin based on just a handful of factors. But it's also important that when we talk about driver-based planning, we're not talking about one driver, for all different groups. It's okay to use and give the opportunity for people to have different drivers based on the history and based on correlation. So some in this example were based on occupancy, other was based on headcount. So when you think again about the process, just to give you a visual, the simplest way is to think about the P&L, and we start with the revenue side. So how do we get revenues? Well, our marketing team might help generate leads. Those leads would drive sales, maybe a percentage of it. Our sales then drives production or manufacturing in this case. That manufacturing group would drive the workforce that we would need to support. So all related to revenue, all related to the cost, and maybe some back-end expenses as well. So again, I think this is a process most folks are familiar with. The key with these, though, is really knowing when to apply the drivers and to what groups. So if the business fluctuates, based on some unknown factors, obviously not the best method to use. You do have to consider for organizations that are focused on products, you have to consider those product mixes too. If you use the driver and say units, but if you're budgeting a product mix, you really have to get much more granular because a product mix alone might have different drivers or different pieces that drive that mix. Be mindful too of the fixed costs. Every business have fixed costs associated with it too. So make sure we're accounting for that and when that fixed cost needs to be adjusted based on the variable. One of the biggest challenges, though, we see with driver-based planning is a lot of times people are allocated different costs or their budgets, their profitability, different products or different units have these allocated costs associated with them, and coming upon an agreed-upon approach for what those drivers should be. And maybe it's not always headcount. Maybe it's not always revenue. Maybe it's units. Maybe it's based on external factors. So it's something that once you establish your driver-based planning methodologies, you really have to reconsider them. Every year they should at least be reevaluated. So you make sure that everyone's being treated right because your business changes, internal, external factors change. The drivers that you used a year ago or 2 years ago might not be as valid as the drivers used today. Next, I want to talk about zero-based planning, and this is probably one of the most common types of budgeting methodology. So it's really starting from scratch. Right? There's no assumptions, there's account line items, other than they're starting with a zero value and you build them up. I see this a lot. Sometimes people will start with just a view of what my actuals look like, and then for the budget, it's completely blank. That's what we call zero-based planning. So with zero-based planning, you need to refresh a current process, or we see people using this when they need to refresh a current process as opposed to the forecast. So when it's budget time, you might start from scratch. Forecast every month along the way, but when it comes to the budget, let's start from the beginning. If you don't have any particular drivers or trends like the previous methodologies that you can use any data that's practical, you might want to start from zero. Also, we're starting to see this a little bit more too with cost-cutting measures. And let's justify every single, or make the business justify every single cost, every single expense, every penny, and build it up. So both on the cost and the expense side, we see zero-based planning as an example of an opportunity to potentially cut some costs if you're using more run rate or trends of information. So there's a food processing organization out there that was acquired by another organization. And when they were acquired, before they were acquired, they were using a methodology of predictive planning where they were run rating all their expenses. And so this acquiring company came in and said, hey guys, we're going to make you start from scratch. So what they did was they wiped out their entire budget and said, let's build things up. And what they found was there were some expenses that were just being carried over time and time again, some shared services costs that really could have been consolidated, even some luxurious items like jets, planes for the company that were just carried again and again and really didn't have that much purpose or that much use. So they required it down to the penny for even the most mundane expenses, and the real goal was to help reduce costs. So regardless of what methodology you use, this one might not be the most efficient, but it really is good when you're in some cost-cutting measures to make people justify all those numbers. So the process, pretty simple. Start with a blank spreadsheet. I was tempted to just show a blank spreadsheet here, right? Or use whatever system or tool you have and start with zeros. Maybe you have last year's actuals as a compare or the forecast as a compare, but really need to start from scratch and then justify every number as you build it up. You might even need to justify those numbers with some commentary or text surrounding it. So this is a simple one to explain. And again, not the most efficient, but it's sometimes worthwhile. So when I talk about these considerations, it does have significant impact on time needed for the business. If you think that you want to forecast on a monthly basis and you're going to ask the team to start from zero every time, you're not going to be the most popular person in the world, right? That takes a lot of time to do things from zero each month, each quarter, each year. When you're a very large organization, you don't have a distributed system, it's very, very messy. Someone has to consolidate all this information and gather it on a timely basis. And even with systems in place outside of spreadsheets, it can still be a challenge. You can use this in combination. We see this sometimes that people do a bottoms-up or zero-based and then have a tops-down with a negotiation between the two. So there might be some high-level goals that are put in terms of revenue that are distributed down to the group, and then at the same time, you have the zero-based built up, and then there's a meeting of the minds where the two groups kind of discuss where they can meet in the middle and really try to achieve. But like I said, the last point here, if you're reorganizing, if you really need to kind of get rid of some waste, it does help with that process. If there's been material changes in the business, it can really help with that reorganization and setting the right budget. The next one is rolling forecast. Again, this is a very, very popular one that we're starting to see more and more folks want to do, not as many folks implementing it. So rolling forecasts are really just on a monthly or quarterly update, or monthly or quarterly updating your forecast. When we talk about rolling, what's different between how I see a lot of groups doing it is in Q1, they'll do 12-month budget. In Q2, they'll do the remaining 9 months or the last 3 quarters. And then in Q3, they'll do the last 2 quarters or last 6 months. A true rolling forecast keeps it going for 12 to 18 months. So when you close Q1 for this year, you're forecasting Q1 of next year. So it's always 4 quarters or 12 to 18 months of forecast. So when is this important? When do we see folks using this? Well, this is really when the business is changing rapidly, right? When other prediction methodologies don't necessarily work, and you need to be a little more proactive than reactive. If resources are available to make accurate updates, you can use this methodology with things like driver base, with some components of predictive planning. So even the methodologies themselves are not mutually exclusive, but all should be considered. So I can have users update just a few drivers each month or each quarter and roll the forecast for the remaining 12. So I'm using a mix of both. For rolling forecast, obviously the most critical pieces are your revenue and cost, right? We're defined by our revenue. Organizations are named by how much revenue they sell, or how much revenue they have. So this is where rolling forecasts are most critical. A lot of times people will say, do I need rolling forecasts for my expense data? Probably not as critical, right? And this is where you can have a mix of different methodology, even within your business. For expenses, it's a lot more run rate, but sometimes groups want to do rolling forecasts on the expense side as well. But really, the revenue and the cost are the most critical. So an example of a rolling forecast, another organization we work with, they're an international manufacturing distribution organization with clients all over the world. Each country had different external factors that impacted them. So in the U.S., in South America, in different parts of Europe, when things were going on with Greece, when things were going on with Germany, there was an impact. In Asia, there was an impact with the different exchange rates. And so they needed each business unit, each geographical business unit, to be able to predict what the revenue and costs are going to be based on these external factors. So they went with a rolling forecast method to really help with driving, what's my total financials going to be here? What are the fluctuations in exchange rates? What impact are those going to have? Because they're changing a lot more rapidly than I expected. And what it did was it allowed the company to plan throughout the year more accurately as those factors change. Now, the other thing I think that's critical with a rolling forecast is just to have that vision down the road. What's interesting, if people have a 12-month rolling forecast, what we sometimes see is the annual budget process almost becomes a non-thing or a non-issue, where they just roll into the budget because they've been updating it every month anyways. They don't need to start from scratch. So if you're able to predict the business that way, get those users involved, it does make the process a little bit simpler. So pretty straightforward example. You bring in actuals into the process every period, and then you forecast out the remaining. So again, here's an example of an 18-month rolling forecast or a 6-quarter rolling forecast where we're bringing in actuals every quarter, and then we're rolling out the remainder. So some considerations. It does depend on accuracy of the actual data coming in. If you use an ERP system or operational system where it's hard to get that data out or it's hard to get it out on a timely basis so that people can make accurate forecasts, this system is going to be hard. This method is going to be hard. As I mentioned, we do generally see this in conjunction with driver-based planning. And the reason we see that is because rolling forecasts takes a toll on end users every month or every quarter to update their information. And with driver-based, they're not updating every single aspect, but they're updating just those key drivers. So a combination of a rolling forecast with driver-based minimizes some of the effort asked of the team. And as mentioned, the budget process often becomes simpler because you're just rolling right into the budget. What is important, though, is the rolling forecast isn't as critical for every account. I mentioned the expenses, not as critical, especially for some of the simpler expenses. Maybe the salaries that is important for because that's a big part of your operating expenses. But some of the other general administrative expenses, asking those cost centers to update the expenses associated with G&A, probably not as critical. Then use some of the predictive planning, use some of that run rate methodology, and just kind of trend it out a bit. So that's a quick run through of some of the different methodologies. Again, they're not exclusive. So when I give you my final thoughts here, one thing I really want you to keep in mind is don't think about, I need to do a rolling forecast and I need to do it for the whole organization, or I need to do more driver-based planning, I need to do it for everybody. We don't recommend that. It's not important to do that. There are certain things, certain accounts, certain business units, products, or services you are going to want to predict more often. Others, you're just going to want to trend. Identify how your business operates. Let us help with those sort of conversations and discussions so we can tell you where to use what methods. There's a lot of talk about technology, too, and I didn't want to make this technology-focused, but more process-focused. The technology is great at facilitating some of the speed of this and helping with consolidating, helping with getting your reports back, helping you do the tops-down and bottoms-up. So technology today has really helped improve processes that spreadsheets cannot do. Spreadsheets are great for adding rows and columns together, but when you try to run a whole budget cycle on a spreadsheet, it becomes a challenge. With technology today, you can also do things like, let me make my 10% adjustment here, or let me drive the whole organization by doing a shift up in headcount, or 10% increase in revenue, or production increase by 5%, and have it push throughout the whole model instead of redistributing out to all the different groups. The other final thought is no matter what methodology you use, is to have a few scenarios planned. So you should always have at least a best case, at least a worst case, and a middle one. So at a minimum, 3 different scenarios. What if business does well? What if business does poorly? What if it stays the course? If you're not prepared for those different models, for those different scenarios within your forecast process, you're going to find yourself reacting a lot of times, again, instead of being proactive. And again, technology can help with this. With clicks of buttons, technology can create new scenarios to make that a little bit simpler. When in Excel, you're literally creating a whole other file or another tabs or things like that. So this is where technology really helps. But regardless of your process, regardless of the tools, always have a few scenarios. so that you, again, can apply the appropriate ones when needed. And using some of these simpler methodologies makes that scenario planning a little bit easier. That was our presentation for today. We wanted to keep this short, but give you guys some of those concepts to really keep in mind. Again, if you have questions or comments, you can email me. Here's my contact information, as well as Greg, who introduced us on the call, and his contact information as well. Greg,
thank you, Scott. Hey, thanks, Scott. And thank you all for joining us today for the webinar, Got Your Budgeting Wrong? Why Your Budgeting Practice is Killing Your Bottom Line. As Scott had mentioned, our contact information is displayed on your screen, and please don't hesitate to contact us. And thank you again, and have a great day.